Welcome back to A Localized Journey, the series where we take a long hard look at the localization of various games across time. As I'm sure you're well aware, seeing as this is part 4, the first game we've been looking at in this series is the original Pokemon Red. And last time, back in part 3, we left off just after defeating Lieutenant Surge and earning our 3rd gym badge, which means our next order of business is to reach Lavender Town by way of the Rock Tunnel found to the east of Vermillion City. However, in order to actually see where we're going, we're going to need the HM for Flash, which is provided to us by one of Professor Oak's aides in return for catching 10 different types of Pokemon. On our way to claim Flash from this aide, we run into a man who tells us about the Rock Tunnel, and we find out from him that the name used for this tunnel is actually localized. The original Japanese name is Iwayama Tonneru, which literally means Rocky Mountain Tunnel or Craggy Mountain Tunnel. The interesting thing about this localization is that in the original name, the tunnel is something that is part of the larger Rocky Mountain, while in the localized version, the tunnel is the focus with rock used as a descriptor. Rather than have the player hone in on the idea that we're traversing a rocky mountain by means of a tunnel, it was instead decided that we should be more focused on the tunnel itself, or at least that's how I interpreted these two names. Also en route to Professor Oak's aid, we come across a scientist-looking fellow who tells us that out-of-combat moves can be used even if a Pokemon is fainted. And while the conversation here is pretty well translated, the term for fainted, on the other hand, is not. In Japanese, when a Pokemon is fainted, it is said to be in a Hinshi Jotai, or near-death state. As I'm sure you can tell, this was most likely changed because having Pokemon enter a near-death state upon running out of HP in battle would be a bit on the risky side when it comes to Western audiences. Obviously, I don't agree with this change because it essentially amounts to censorship, but I do concede that this may not have been a change decided upon by a localizer. That doesn't make it any less bad in my opinion though, because at the end of the day, we still received a censored product. It's just a matter of who decided to censor this particular term. In the same house as the previous scientist, we run into a kid who asks us to trade him an Abra in return for his Mr. Mime. Mr. Mime's Japanese name is Bariyado, which comes from the transliterations of 2 English words into Japanese. Those words are barrier, or bariya, and barricade, or barricado. Moving on to Oak's aid, he tells us in English that Flash will light up even the darkest dungeons. This was changed from the original, which was just, no matter how dark the place, Flash will light it up perfectly. This whole idea of dark dungeons was just pulled out of absolutely nowhere. But anyway, we get our HM, return to Cerulean to pick up a bike, and then we head east. The first trainer we run into on this route is a Girl Scout who says in Japanese, "Oh, you're carrying Pokemon, aren't you? What a duck." The inferred meaning here is actually untranslatable, so I'll just explain what it means. In Japanese, there's a saying, "Kamo ga negi o shotte kuru." This literally means, the duck comes carrying a negi, or Japanese green onion. This phrase is used to refer to someone who is gullible or naive enough to do something or bring you something that is to your benefit, referring to how if a duck were to bring you a negi, you would have an easy time cooking it into a duck hot pot. A shortening of this phrase is just to say something like, "Kamo da wa koitsu," or "this guy's a duck." In this scenario, the Girl Scout is referring to the fact that you brought Pokemon with you, which means she can battle you. I'm not super sure about this, but it could also mean that she intends to defeat you and then steal your Pokemon, which is not very Girl Scout-like behavior in my opinion. The English localization of this dialogue is understandably rather far off, being, "You have Pokemon with you, you're mine." Now, was there a better way to localize this? Yes. You could have said something like, "You have Pokemon with you, how naive," or "You have Pokemon with you, that's just what I was hoping for." These would have been more faithful options in my opinion, but at the end of the day, this is a rather tricky bit of text to localize. When battling this Girl Scout, she sends out a Bellsprout, and this just so happens to be the first time we've encountered one. In Japanese, Bellsprout is known as Mada Tsubomi. This name comes from the 2 Japanese words Mada, meaning still, and Tsubomi, meaning bud. Put them together and you get still a bud. It's a very literal name referring to the fact that Bellsprout is the first stage in its evolutionary tree. Finishing off the interaction with this Girl Scout, she says, "You deceived me," in English. This was localized from the original Japanese, which is, "Oh, you're strong, aren't you?" In the English, the part where she compliments you on your strength is completely gone, and the focus is instead put on this weird idea that we deceived her by being a strong trainer or something like that. I understand what the localizer was going for here, but it just missed the mark entirely in my opinion. A little ways down the road, we run into a Boy Scout who, upon losing, says, "out like a light" in English. If you assumed this was another weird over-localization, then you're learning well, because that is exactly the case here. In the original Japanese, this Boy Scout just says, "I lost." Plain and simple. He does use an accent, but that doesn't alter the meaning of what he said. The next trainer we encounter is a bug catcher who is very diligent in raising his bug Pokemon. In English, he says he got up early every day to raise his Pokemon from cocoons. However, in Japanese, he has an extra line at the end that says they finally hatched. Of course, in the English, it is implied that they hatched because it's stated that he trained them from cocoons, but that still doesn't excuse the unwarranted alteration to the original work. But not only that, in the English, we have no idea how long it's been since this trainer's Pokemon hatched. It could be days, weeks, months, or even years, we just have no idea. But in the original, it's stated that they just hatched, meaning he's only had battle-ready Pokemon for a short while now. There was really no good reason to remove this extra information. Both of this bug catcher's Pokemon are Beedrill, which is yet another new Pokemon to us. In Japanese, Beedrill is simply known as Spia, which is a transliteration of the English word spear, referring to Beedrill's rather large, spear-like stinger. Another possible origin for the name Spia would be an anagram of Apisu, or Apis, the genus of honeybees. Later, one of this bug catcher's Beedrill uses Fury Attack on me, which is another example of a name that was changed far too much. The original Japanese move is called Midare Tsuki, literally meaning chaotic or wild thrusts. Honestly, I'm fine with the Fury part of this localization, because it could be argued that Fury is somewhat close to the meaning of Midare in this context, but attack is just a cop-out in my opinion. The term used was a clear and defined type of attack. A thrust or a stab or even a jab, but we just got bland old attack. And it doesn't even make the move sound cooler. In my opinion, furious thrusts or furious stabs would sound way better. When you beat this bug catcher, he says, "What a total waste of time" in English. Now, let me ask you, what is he referring to here? Is he referring to the battle that we just had? Because based on the recency, that could easily be the conclusion drawn here. Or is he referring to the time spent raising his Pokemon from when they were cocoons, which is what he talked about before our battle? The original Japanese has the answer for us. In Japanese, he says, "What were my early mornings for?" Meaning he feels his early mornings were wasted because he lost the battle. However, in the English, it's just left up to us to infer this. It's always so bizarre to me when localizers remove information from the source material like this, because they gain absolutely nothing by doing so. They gain nothing, and we lose sometimes very valuable information. It's essentially a lose-a-lose. Next, we come across yet another bug catcher who has undergone some pretty significant localization. His pre-battle dialogue in English is, "Go, my super bug Pokemon." This is an altered version of the original Japanese, which is "Go, my cute bug Poke." He uses a shortened version of the already shortened Pokemon in Japanese, which is Poke. And as you can see, this was reverted back to just Pokemon in the English. I'm honestly not sure how I feel about this change. On the one hand, changing the word back to Pokemon avoids potential confusion with the English word poke, which would definitely have been a confusion for some, but on the other hand, you could have just slightly changed the nickname to something like Bug Pokies with a Y. I'm not a huge fan of made-up nicknames in localization because they always sound super cringe to me, but in this case, it would be a closer approximation to what was actually said than reverting the shortening back to Pokemon. If I had to choose, I'd probably go with the nickname route if just using Bug Poke was out of the question. But that's not the only change in this interaction, as I'm sure you noticed. The word cute was also changed to super for some arbitrary reason. I'd love to know what that reason was, because as it stands, this is just change for the sake of change, which is the absolute worst way to localize a game in my opinion. This bug catcher has a total of 3 Pokemon, the last of which is a Venonat. Venonat is called Konpan in the original Japanese games. This comes from another transliteration from English, in this case compound eye or compoundo eye. There is also a possible connection to the Japanese word for insect, which is konchu, but I'd say the compound eye theory is much more likely. After we finally defeat this bug catcher, we fight our way through a few more trainers with pretty good localizations, and eventually run into the final trainer who saw some questionable changes on this route. That trainer is a Girl Scout who says, "No holding back just because I'm a girl, okay?" in Japanese, and "Don't you dare condescend me" in English. I kind of get what the localizer was going for here with the word condescend, but that word can have so many different meanings in this scenario. The specific meaning that they wanted you to pick up on was presumably that she didn't want you to be condescending by holding back in battle, but that's not necessarily the first thing that will come to someone's mind when reading this. Also, as we have seen a number of times before, the localization of Pokemon Red has tried very hard to remove any references to gender in the dialogue, and this is another prime example of that. But even if you wanted to remove the part about her being a girl, you still could have just left it as "don't hold back, okay?" or something along those lines. Why make her sound so standoffish with a sentence like, "Don't you dare condescend me," when that's not how she sounded in the original game? It's such a weird localization choice to make. But anyway, this Girl Scout has a single Pokemon, and that is Meowth. Meowth is known as Nyasu in Japanese, which was apparently taken from the name of Tajiri Satoshi's actual cat, according to a number of Japanese sources. The name comes from the Japanese onomatopoeia for a cat's meow, which is nya. All things considered, this is an example of a pretty close localization of a Pokemon's name that wasn't just taken directly from the Japanese like Pikachu. One way to spell Nyasu with English characters would be with a TH at the end, which is presumably where we got Meowth. Also, as you may know, Meowth has a special move called Payday, and I happen to encounter that in this battle as well. Payday is known as Neko ni koban in Japanese, which literally means koban to a cat, where koban is an old Japanese currency with a decent amount of value. It's actually the coin visible on Meowth's head. The phrase Neko ni koban is used to reference the act of giving someone something of great value, but that person doesn't appreciate the value of what you've given them. For example, I don't drink alcohol, so if you were to give me the world's most expensive wine, I would have no idea what makes that wine valuable. It's like giving a cat a koban, would be another way to put it. Moving on to the rock tunnel now, the sign outside had a small change made to it during localization. The English sign just says rock tunnel, while the Japanese sign says this is the rock tunnel. Like I said, it's a very small change, and it doesn't really affect anything, but it's still a change nonetheless. Inside the tunnel, we cross paths with our very first Pokemaniac. In Japanese, these trainers are called Kaiju Mania. Kaiju are a genre of Japanese monsters that are typically very large and often fight against heroes and hero groups like the Power Rangers. A very well-known example of a kaiju would be Godzilla. So this trainer type refers to someone who is a maniac or fanatic for kaiju, but that was changed to be someone who is a maniac for Pokemon in the English localization. In my opinion, this removes a lot of the personality that this trainer archetype had in the original, because instead of being someone who's really obsessed with kaiju to the point that it became a personality trait, they just really like Pokemon like every other character in the game. The first Pokemon this Pokemaniac has is a Cubone, and you guessed it, it's another first-time encounter. Cubone is known as kata kata in Japanese, which is just literally an onomatopoeia that can represent the sound of bones rolling around or rattling. Alternatively, it could come from another meaning for kata kata, which is dry, like the old bones Cubone uses. When we went out over this Pokemaniac, he says game over in English, which is very much an unnecessary localization. In the original, he just says, "I was defeated." I assume the whole game over thing came from the idea that this guy is a Pokemaniac who loves video games. However, as far as I can tell, his pre-battle and lost quotes are meant to reference different writing tropes in the Japanese tokusatsu, or special effects genre, as well as the kaiju genre, which was completely lost in translation. And another Pokemaniac we run into underwent a rather similar change. When he challenges you to a battle, he says, "Excuse me, do you know about Pokemon cosplay?" Now, seeing as cosplay wasn't nearly as big in the West back in the 90s as it is today, you'd think the term would have been obliterated without a trace, but that's not the case here. In English, he says, "Do you know about costume players?" Oddly enough, the part that was removed without a trace is the fact that Pokemon is the target of the cosplay. That's such a random thing to take out, seeing as this is a Pokemaniac, and we're playing a Pokemon game right now. Why not just make it, "Do you know about Pokemon costume players?" That would leave the original meaning relatively intact, and also dodge the shortening to cosplay, which was less understandable than costume play back then. Next, we come across another example of Pokemon Red's localizers slipping random pop culture references into their localizations. This hiker who just says, "If you're a man, come at me with a boom" in Japanese, had his dialogue changed to "hit me with your best shot" in English. This is a reference to the popular song by Pat Benatar of the same name. Now, the end result here does have some relation to the original Japanese, seeing as the hiker asks you to come at him with a boom, but once we get to the lost quote, that all goes out the window. That lost quote is, "I was done in with a boom" in Japanese, but fired away in English. Fired away is a line from the same song as the intro text. And as you can see, this has nothing to do with the original Japanese lost quote. The localizer just wanted to keep up their weird song reference as long as possible, so we got a very far-off localization as a result. Really makes you wonder how this made it through QA, if there even was any QA done for the Western release of the game. Another hiker in the same area says, "I'll leave you panting with my Pokemon technique" in Japanese, which was changed to "My Pokemon technique will leave you crying" in English. This is a weird one because you'd think, based on all the changes we've seen up until this point, that they want to keep the game more child-friendly, but making someone cry is far from that in my opinion. The only possible reason for this change that I can think of is that the original phrasing of this sentence in Japanese could be seen as being sexual in nature. The original uses the phrase "hi iwaseru," which means "I'll make you pant or breathe heavily," often referring to you-know-what. However, that doesn't have to be the case. It could just mean to make someone work so hard they run out of breath. And when localized into English, this phrase would lose most of those kinds of connotations anyway, based on what I can see, so why change it? A few hikers later, we come across our first Graveler in this playthrough. In the Japanese version of the game, Graveler is called goron. This comes from the onomatopoeia for rolling in Japanese, which is goro goro or goron goron. There is also the possible connection to the transliteration of stone or stone. A Girl Scout on the next floor has intro dialogue in Japanese that says, "Girl Scouts leave twigs as markers as they walk so they don't get lost in the mountains." As you might have guessed, this was changed in the English version of the game. The English localization is "Hikers leave twigs as trail markers." Now you might remember that the Japanese trainer type Girl Scout was changed to Junior Trainer Girl in the English localization. Presumably for this reason we're talking about hikers now and not Girl Scouts, which is really weird coming from a random junior trainer in a cave. Also, the reasoning as to why people leave twigs behind as they hike, as well as the specific setting of the mountains, were completely removed for whatever reason. Another floor up, we encounter a different Girl Scout who says, "Don't try anything funny in the dark." The weird thing about this translation is that it is pretty much exactly what is said in the original Japanese. Why is that odd, you might ask? Well, the implication here seems to be of the risque variety, so one would think that such a thing would be changed or removed based on what we've seen so far, but it wasn't. There are a bunch of examples of very similar dialogue that was changed for presumably the exact reason this would need to be changed, but for some reason, in this instance, everything was fine. Just a really weird example of inconsistency in the localization. The next trainer we fight is yet another Girl Scout who, upon losing, says, "You play hard" in English, but "I'll try again" in Japanese. The directions of these two sentences are completely different for no reason. In the English, the subject is the player, but in the Japanese, it's the Girl Scout. Like, why? "I'll try again" or "I'll come back again" would have been perfectly fine translations for what she said, while also maintaining the integrity of the original, so why did we get "You play hard"? Just another baffling decision. After exiting the rock tunnel, we encounter a Girl Scout for what seems like the 10th time in a row by this point, and she has the evolved form of Pidgey in her team, which is of course Pidgeotto. Pidgeotto's Japanese name is Pigeon, which is just the transliteration of the English word pigeon. This name clearly had to go because you can't have a Pokemon just called Pigeon in the English. The next trainer we battle is a rather infamous one in terms of localization, and that is the Laughing Hiker. Let's talk about his intro quote and lost quote together here to get the full picture. In Japanese, his intro and lost quotes are "ha ha ha" and "ha ha ha ha." The truth is, I accidentally ate a laughing mushroom. This was changed dramatically in the English to be "ha ha ha ah ha" and "ha ha ha, not laughing, ha hay fever, ha 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 chew." So the idea that this hiker was tripping out on some sick shrooms was changed to him having allergies, which is just so far removed from the original. I get that there was probably some reasoning behind the change in terms of game rating and parents, but this did not require such a drastic level of censorship. The best outcome would obviously be to just have the original text faithfully localized, but if that really wasn't possible, at least keep the idea that the hiker's laughing for some reason. Maybe he just likes to laugh, or you could say it was something he ate to be a bit closer to the original. I'm obviously just spitballing here, but pretty much anything would have been better than a hiker with allergies. Moving on now, there's a Pokemaniac just outside Lavender Town that had his dialogue localized relatively faithfully, except for one word. In Japanese, he refers to us as otaku. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with this term in the context of Japanese culture, but in this context, it's just a very specific way to say you. It's not used very often, as it does have very specific connotations and contexts that it's generally used in, but still, if you were to translate it into English, it could just be equated to you or some other form of that word. However, in the case of this localization, they decided to make this Pokemaniac say, "Hey kid," instead of just, "Hey you." In my opinion, this feels much more disrespectful than the original Japanese. When I beat this Pokemaniac, my Pikachu levels up and starts trying to learn Swift. In Japan, Swift is known as Speedosta, or Speed Star. This is literally just the transliterations of the English words speed and star stuck together, which makes this a pretty straightforward name. Why the localizer felt the need to change two entirely English words that make perfect sense with the move and don't sound funny in an English game to a different English word that makes less sense and sounds worse in my opinion, I have absolutely no idea. And now we finally arrive at Lavender Town, which is called Shion Town in Japanese. Shion is very similar to Lavender in terms of color, but based on what I've seen, Shion does seem to be a bit darker. The color Shion is based on the flower of the same name, known as Aster tataricus in English. In the Japanese language of flowers, or hanakotoba, Shion means remembrance, or I will not forget you, which could be why Lavender Town is the Pokemon gravesite. The second kanji in the word Shion also greatly resembles the kanji for death, which could be another possible connection. One way to say death in Japanese is shi, which just so happens to be the first part of Shion as well. Of course, this is just all conjecture, but there really is a lot that could possibly connect this town to death. The town sign says that Lavender Town is the noble purple town in English, but the Japanese is Shion is the precious or sacred purple color. The word used for precious in Japanese can mean noble, but in my opinion, that's not the most common usage of the word, and most likely not what the intention was here for Shion. This is a town meant for mourning the loss of your Pokemon, so I think precious is the best translation here, but I could be wrong. Inside the Pokemon Center, we run into a girl who tells us about Cubone's mom, and if you're familiar with Lavender Town, you know where this is going. In the English game, Cubone's mom is said to have died trying to flee from Team Rocket, but it is specifically stated in Japanese that she was killed by Team Rocket when trying to flee. In the English game, it could be reasoned that it wasn't necessarily Team Rocket that killed Cubone's mom because all we know is that she was fleeing Team Rocket when she died, but in Japanese it's expressly stated that yes, it was Team Rocket who killed her. Moving on, we take a stroll around town and bump into the Volunteer Pokemon House. In Japanese, this house is known as the Volunteer Pokemon House of Love. Similar to what we saw back in Vermillion with the Pokemon Fan Club, the love portion of the name here was removed for some reason. However, unlike the Pokemon Fan Club, I'm not really sure why this name was changed. It could just be an issue with how the name sounds in English, but that's just kind of a shot in the dark. Next to the Volunteer House, we run into a guy who tells us that Lavender Town is famous as the Pokemon Grave, and that if our Pokemon dies, we should bring it here and they'll pray for its happiness in the next world. In the English version of the game, the part about Pokemon dying was completely removed, even though we've already had a reference to death, and we'll see a few more throughout the town. A very weird change considering the circumstances. Next, we visit the Name Rater's house, and it turns out he also has a localized name. In Japanese, he's called the Seimei Handanshi. Seimei Handan is a type of Japanese fortune-telling based on your name, so by referring to himself as the Seimei Handanshi, he's essentially calling himself someone who performs name fortune-telling. I see where the localizer got the idea to call him the Name Rater because the literal meaning of Seimei Handanshi would be something like name decider or name judge, but the implication here is fortune telling, so I think something like name diviner or name teller would have been a bit more representative of the nuance here. Going into a neighboring house, we find the Cubone whose mom was killed, as well as a young woman. The woman basically relates what the girl in the Pokemon Center told us about Team Rocket killing Cubone's mom, but this time in the English, she says that they specifically killed her. Why complicate things with the girl in the Pokemon Center if you were just going to say it here anyway? The Japanese is basically the exact same, so that's definitely not the reason. If someone was to only talk to the girl in the Pokemon Center and not this woman, they could have a completely different idea of what happened here, which could be very confusing down the line. This is yet another example of inconsistency in localization. Now we move over to the mart to see if there's any localization to be had in there, and wouldn't you know, there is. Speaking to the man next to the counter, we find out about the various X items. And as you might expect, all of these items have localized names. X attack is known as Purasupawa, or plus power. X defend is Defenda, or defender. X speed is Speeda, or speeder. And X special is Specialu Uppu, or special up. As you can see, all of these localizations were done even though the original names of these items were entirely English. We've seen examples of changes like this before, but it's still just as baffling of a decision. I think we can all agree these names did not need to be altered for a Western audience. That's all there is to talk about in the Lavender Mart, so we continue on to the main attraction of Lavender Town, the Pokemon Tower. Outside the tower, there's a sign that describes what this building is, and it's yet another example of localization. In Japanese, this sign says, "This is the Pokemon Prayer Tower, the Pokemon Tower." The name Pokemon Tower is just a transliteration from English, so this sentence doesn't sound as weird in the original Japanese. The English here is, "May the souls of Pokemon rest easy, Pokemon Tower." As opposed to the Japanese, which is an introduction of the building and what it's for, the English is just a prayer for dead Pokemon followed by Pokemon Tower. I know I said the Japanese sounded weird when directly translated into English, but you didn't have to replicate that so closely with your localization. Just slapping Pokemon Tower on the end of a prayer makes it seem so out of place, like you remembered you had to include the name of the building on the sign after localizing the first sentence into oblivion. In my opinion, something like "This is the Tower of Prayer for Pokemon," the Pokemon Tower, would have been more faithful to the original and served to alleviate the slight awkwardness of the direct translation. Stepping inside the tower, we encounter a man who says, "I can't forget about my dead Clefairy. Oh no, I'm tearing up," in Japanese. However, in the English version of the game, he says, "I came to pray for my Clefairy. Sniff, I can't stop crying." The main difference here is that this man's Clefairy is specifically stated to be dead in the original Japanese, while in the English, the word dead is nowhere to be found. Obviously, the implication is there, but for some reason in this specific instance, the localizer didn't feel inclined to expressly state that a Pokemon is dead. This contradicts previous conversations we've had in Lavender Town, where it is very clearly stated that a Pokemon has died, like with Cubone's mom. And because someone felt it was necessary to remove this instance of death from Pokemon Red, we basically ended up with a completely different sentence. In the English, this man doesn't miss his Clefairy, he just came to the tower to pray for it. He doesn't start tearing up because he remembers his Clefairy while talking to you, he just can't stop crying. The differences here are immense for no reason that I can see, other than the fact that they didn't want to use the word dead, which was used previously anyway. Next, we talk to the woman in the upper left of the room, and we see this is a very similar situation to the last. In Japanese, she says, "Did you come to visit a grave as well? You're a boy who cares for his Pokemon, aren't you?" This is changed in the localization to be, "Did you come to pay respects? Bless you." So, in Japanese, there's a term called hakamairi, which literally means visit a grave. It's used in situations where you go to see the grave of someone you cared about, typically on the day that they died or other such occasions, and that is the term that we see used here. The English localization of this to pay respects doesn't quite capture the entirety of the connotations and nuance present in the Japanese, in my opinion. A better option would be, "Did you come to make a visit to a grave as well?" By changing up the wording slightly to emphasize the act of visiting a grave, we get at least a slightly better picture of what's going on here, in my opinion. As for the second half of the sentence, there is not really much to say, it's just a travesty. The whole idea that this woman praises you for being a good trainer who visits their dead Pokemon is just gone. Instead, she just says, "Bless you." There was nothing wrong with the original, so it shouldn't have been changed. End of story. Talking to the lady next to the stairs, we learn the original name for the channeler trainer type. In Japanese, they are known as Kitoshi. Shaman would be a close approximation here. Why the name was made channeler, I haven't the slightest idea, because shaman seems just fine to me. This channeler also says, "I sense wandering souls on the upper floors" in Japanese. This is changed to "there are spirits up to mischief" in English. They kind of lessen the scary aspect of this conversation by changing the fact that the spirits or souls are wandering to them just being up to mischief. They're not lost souls trapped between this world and the next, cursed to wander for all eternity. They're just playing pranks, it's all fine. Also, the fact that these spirits are specifically on the upper floors is completely removed for no reason. Now we have absolutely no idea what souls she's talking about. And the last person we talk to in the Pokemon Tower is the lady at the desk. She says, "The Pokemon Tower is a tower that was built to console dead Pokemon," in Japanese. In English, however, she says, "Pokemon Tower was erected in the memory of Pokemon that had died. The thing I really don't like about this localization is that instead of the tower being built to console Pokemon, it was built in their memory. To me, that feels like rather than the tower be for the Pokemon, it's a tower for the trainers. Obviously, this is up to interpretation, but personally, I prefer the original." We also get yet another contradiction here through the use of the word died, which was removed from the gentleman at the entrance's dialogue. It's just one inconsistency after the other with this game, isn't it? Hopefully things will get better as we continue on. But I think that's where I'll leave it for this installment. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end. I know this was a rather long one, so I really do appreciate that. Next time, we'll be moving into Celadon City to check on the various localizations there, so definitely stay tuned for that. And if you did happen to enjoy today's video, consider giving it a like. It's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Ack out.